Hi, welcome to this live stream. I'm Faye D'Souza. This is what's happening in the country today. Of course, the India bloc has met, and there have been some murmurs and suggestions from Arvind Kejriwal and Mamata Banerjee that Congress President Mallikarjun Kharge be the possible prime ministerial candidate for the India bloc. Mr. Kharge has turned around and said, let's first win and then we'll decide. But it's an interesting and a powerful suggestion for, a member of the scheduled caste to be prime minister of, or a prime ministerial candidate of, of those parties. But that's not what this conversation is about. This conversation is about a larger sort of constitutional crisis that we must talk about. Even more MPs were suspended from Parliament today. 49 Lok Sabha MPs were suspended from the House for disrupting proceedings today, a day after 78 opposition MPs were suspended yesterday, taking the total number of suspensions during the winter session of Parliament to 141. So 141 MPs stand suspended from Parliament. Now, this include names like Farooq Abdullah of the National Conference, Shashi Tharoor, Manish Tiwari, Karti Chidambaram, Dimple Yadav from the Samajwadi Party, and Supriya Sule from the NCP. Lots of big names. They were all protesting outside of Parliament, and this does bring us to ask a larger question. We are a constitutional democracy. We're a parliamentary democracy. How does Parliament function if all of the opposition MPs or most of the opposition MPs are sitting outside because they have been suspended? Now, this is an all-time record of the number of MPs who have been suspended in Parliament at all. And we're going to ask the question of why is this happening? And to join us to answer that question right now, I have Sanjay Hegde, who is a senior advocate of the Supreme Court. Mr. Hegde is joining us from Udupi, where his internet connection is a little weak. So I'm going to ask our audience to bear with us if it goes in and out. But Mr. Hegde, I thank you so much for giving us time to talk about this matter, because I personally think that in a democracy where opposition is as important as the government of the day, something like this requires us to sort of stop for a second and consider. I know that there's no part of our constitution that mentions suspensions in Parliament. These are rules of the House. But how will a democracy function if opposition is being suspended, expelled in this manner?
Well, democracies don't function. Forget democracies, even monarchies fail to function when the monarch refused to honor Parliament. You must remember that the French Revolution started when Louis XVI shut the doors of the French Parliament, and the deputies of the day then stepped out and stood on the tennis court and took a famous oath, which is called the tennis court oath. You also have had, in English history, you've had Charles I being overthrown by Parliament. And Oliver Cromwell's great line, "You have sat far too long to be of any use. In God's name, now go." This is ultimately, Parliament is the mechanism through which a country debates, discusses, and comes to a conclusion as to what the way forward is. If you have only one party in Parliament, then there is no debate, there is no discussion, there is no alternative idea. To make things worse, in India, we have the 10th schedule, which is the Anti-Defection Act. So MPs are bound by the whip of the parties that they are elected on. They cannot even come, it cannot be that even within a party, there can be two voices. So if you expel the opposition in Indian Parliament, effectively you are not hearing the other side. In our first past the post system, a party that wins 51% of the vote may end up with getting 70% or 80% of the seats, and a party which gets 49% of the vote may get just about 10 or 20%. So a whole host of voters are effectively disenfranchised when opposition MPs are simply suspended. And what does suspension mean? That the House will not admit them, will not
Mm.
take them into account, nor will they be allowed to vote on any particular issue. This is not how a parliamentary form of democracy was intended to be run in this country. It reminds me of what Dr. Ambedkar said right in the beginning in 1949. He said, however good or bad a constitution we have written, that will be told in the working of it. If uh, Even if we write a good constitution, if it is operated badly, it will fail. Even a bad constitution operated well will succeed. There is
Mr.
something called constitutionalism, which also works through conventions, which is largely being ignored.
Mr. Hegde, if we consider the position that the speakers of both houses were in, and the manner in which this matter has been handled, was there any other option on the table for the government of the day rather than suspension? Because we've seen, for example, towards the last end term of the UPA, the BJP had decided to disrupt the House, had decided that no business would go forward, and that was their strategy. And they publicly said so to the media that this is the strategy that we're following. But at that point, we didn't see anyone being suspended, even though there were MPs that stormed the well of the House. What are the other options available to the Speaker when there are disruptions other than suspension?
I mean, are disruptions being done just for the sake of disrupting? Are these parliamentarians mere naughty boys who are sending paper rockets and throwing spitballs at each other and not allowing a classroom to go on? No. The disruption is for one particular issue, that when Parliament's security was breached, parliamentarians are entitled to know the causes of the breach and the remedies thereof. When Parliament was attacked by armed men, no less, during the first NDA, during Mr. Vajpayee's time, the then Home Minister, Mr. Advani, did make a statement to Parliament. Ultimately, when you make a statement to Parliament, it is the government which is speaking to the country as a whole. It can't be that, the government says that we will make no statements to Parliament, we will make our statements to chosen people in the media, and that if the House doesn't function, so be it, that we will suspend everyone. The point also is that there is something called accountability of the cabinet to Parliament. That's the linchpin of our parliamentary system. That too is not being adhered to. And this is all leaving aside the politics. If you talk of politics, I think the opposition has made uh, a mistake in focusing only on parliamentary security.
Yeah.
If they had focused on unemployment, which caused those people to come into Parliament, throw smoke bombs, and emulate Bhagat Singh, who threw a pamphlet which said "Making the Deaf Hear." If the opposition had made unemployment the issue on which they wanted to hear from the government, or they wanted the nation to hear from the government, maybe these kind of suspensions would not have been that easy.
Mr. Hegde, we have two very interesting questions from Prajakta on our chat window. She actually asks what happens here because the voters who voted for these suspended MPs have now effectively been disenfranchised. They have no representation inside of Parliament. And yet we know that legislation is being passed. There were bills that were passed even today after these MPs were suspended. Is there room here for these MPs to approach the courts, or is the court unlikely at this point to interfere with the functioning of Parliament?
See, the normal law going from pre-independence days is that courts have a hands-off approach as far as parliaments and legislatures are concerned. It goes all the way back to the 19th century when there was a gentleman called Charles Bradlaugh, who was an atheist and who refused to take the oath in the name of God. The speaker thereafter denied him a seat. He moved the courts, and the court said no. Parliament is supreme. We cannot interfere, and that was the general basis for a hands-off approach. But in India, the law has been changing. For instance, you had the anti-defection bills, which made the speaker a tribunal, effectively, on anti-defection, and his
Yes.
decisions were then taken up in judicial review. So even when people have been expelled from the house, like in the cash for bribery case in Raja Rampal, courts have reviewed the system of expulsion. They upheld Parliament's action at that point of stage. But the key point is that courts now have a leeway to review things if they do want to. But having said all that, I think those who are running Parliament know very well that after this session, there's only a token kind of budget session for a vote of account, and people are going to go directly into the elections. That if the courts do take it up, they're unlikely to render a verdict in time. And so maybe that has also been factored into the calculus.
In fact, speaking to us yesterday, TMC MP Saket Gokhale had categorically said that the opposition doesn't plan to approach the courts. They're in fact saying, let's see how many MPs you will suspend altogether. Let the the citizens see what the government wants to do. But I do want to ask you this: important bills are being passed without discussion. And like we said, the voters who voted for these parliamentarians have lost their ability to question and to understand what the government is moving through parliament, because things have been, are not functioning as they should. What are the rights of the voters here in our constitutional democracy? Can a voter go to court and say, my system is no longer functioning in my favor?
Well, I doubt that a voter will be entertained by the courts, because the courts can always turn around and say that the person whom you elected has not chosen to move the courts. But yes, the voters have a legitimate concern, but the answer often is political, and it is not in the realm of legality and the courts. Yeah, the closest example I can think of was Rajiv Gandhi, who had a 400-seat majority in 1985. Bofors broke out, and towards the end of that particular parliament, almost the entire opposition walked out. Parliament continued only with the ruling party, and effectively there was a certain kind of invalidation of the regime itself. Today, you have a regime which is throwing out huge numbers of the opposition. And I think the only answer for the voters as a whole is probably to ensure that no such government with a strong majority or with a majoritarian instinct is returned back, or at least that the opposition is returned back in sufficient number. We voters do tend to have what's called the bandwagon effect. People like to know who the winning side is in their constituency, and they want to say that I voted for the winning side. What happens as a consequence is that sides which are marginally ahead end up with majorities that make them arrogant. It is incumbent on the voters also to elect not only a strong government, but a strong opposition.
Mr. Hegde, would you say that the opposition in this case did the right thing by disrupting the House? Were there other options available to the opposition when it's demanding answers from the government other than to disrupt, hold up placards, and storm the well?
Well, in a well-oiled democracy, you should see probably the Prime Minister's question hour in British Parliament. You should see, I would invite your viewers to see the Brexit debates and how the Speaker, John Bercow, handled them, giving no quarter to both the opposition as well as the ruling party. They, if there were methods which ensured that effective questions could be asked and effective answers procured rather than the motions being gone through, then maybe such protests would not be justified. The very fact that a lot of stuff happens just in a routine fashion necessarily involves that when protests have to be made, people get innovative about it. Well, what else is to be done? If you are not being heard in Parliament, do you stand outside Parliament? Right now, I believe the chairman of the Rajya Sabha is pretty angry that he has been imitated outside Parliament.
Yes.
Then where all does the remit of the Honorable Vice President, who too is a senior advocate by the way, run? Can you not imitate him in the corridors of the Supreme Court, for instance? So please, the chairman of the House of the People and the House of States are concerned only with the running within Parliament. I don't think that in a functioning democracy, we ennoble our constitutional authorities so much so that they cannot be questioned in any forum whatsoever.
Well, it's interesting you called the Vice President and the chair of the Rajya Sabha, the chairperson of the Rajya Sabha, is a constitutional position, which means that once appointed, this individual no longer belongs to any party and has to only be loyal to the constitution of the country. Would you, in your opinion, Mr. Hegde, judge the actions of the Speaker of the Lok Sabha and the chair of the Rajya Sabha as constitutional, or was it partisan? Did he side with one party?
Why do you need my opinion? The people will speak. Of course, they have been partisan. You please contrast it with somebody like Somnath Chatterjee, who was Speaker of the Lok Sabha. And despite his party saying no, vote against the government, he said, no, I will exercise my independent mind, because once I have become the Speaker, I belong to no party. He took his stance. I don't think the party repeated him as a candidate thereafter, but nevertheless, he remained true to his office. Right now, we seem to be seeing increasing demonstration of servility to the government of the day. The government cannot function if all nuts and bolts of constitutional machinery do not perform their job. If it is their job to be totally independent, or if it is their job to tighten certain levers, then just because they were elected by the government, by the party that runs the government, and if they do not do their job, machinery will.
So actually, I want to ask you about our, what we call the checks and balances in our democracy, right? So we have the government of the day that is meant to be checked by the opposition. As we have seen, that is becoming weaker with every passing day. Meant to be checked by the free press, who is supposed to be asking questions and demanding answers of government. It's no longer doing that, we all know for sure. And then the third is our judiciary. Are these, depending on how these arms are functioning, Mr. Hegde, how would you rate our democracy on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 being the weakest.
Well, there have been times when our democracy has been imperiled in the past, during the emergency, for instance. And I think we are very close to those times, if not already there. The difference between those days and now is that in those days there was an official declaration, B, it ended after a certain period of time, and C, there was no amplification of the official line through an unending barrage on 24/7 television plus social media. Right now, a whole host of people are who do not necessarily want to think very deeply are constantly being fed only one message, which is amplified through algorithms. I think we are now in a more dangerous state than we were in 1975. Uh, so, on a scale of 1 to 10, we are an electoral authoritarian state currently. The need for elections too, I do not know how long they will continue. So, what can I mark it? I can't give it passing marks. If passing marks were 33.3, I would say we are at around 25.
Wow. What about our agencies, Mr. Hegde? The government has recently passed a bill that allows effectively the Prime Minister and one cabinet minister to choose the election commissioners. Enough has been said about the CBI, about the ED, about these investigative agencies within our country, about the manner in which the police is functioning in various states. Where does that really leave us as citizens at this point?
Well, see, ultimately, what is the source of the government's power? Or what is the source of the power that the media wields? Or the power that the courts wield? It is public trust in them. Any institution that seeks to dominate to the negation of all other institutions may have a temporary surge, but in the long run will be weakened tremendously. So, at this stage, if the citizens then take on the jobs that the journalists and the courts are supposed to be doing, of asking questions of their representatives and expressing their judgment on those questions through the voting machines, then there is hope. Because that is what democracies are about hearing everyone, hearing even dissenting voices, and trying to accommodate and carry on as many people as possible. If you rule by diktat, it is not a democracy.
Mr. Hegde, the government has also passed some legislation recently. It's looking to change the IPC, which is the criminal laws in India, the CRPC, perhaps give some arguments more teeth to, to laws about sedition, on who will be considered an enemy of the state or not. Does that put basic freedom of speech at risk at this point, given our opposition is standing outside?
Of course, the criminal law amendments, and this is such major legislation. They've been rushed through Parliament. They were introduced, then they went to a standing committee. Many members have written their dissents, but nevertheless, they might be passed in a Parliament which is bereft of the opposition, and I have written about it elsewhere. What essentially these legislations do is to tilt the balance even more towards the policeman and take away much more from the citizen. We are effectively looking at a police state being brought into being through legislation which is endorsed by a parliament that lacks an opposition.
Mr. Hegde, the two parliamentarians, the three parliamentarians who were standing outside of Rajya Sabha making fun of the vice president and the manner in which he speaks and laughing and making a video, which we saw the vice president look very distressed about inside of the house. In your opinion, was that unparliamentary, and should they have not done it? Does it weaken their stand as an opposition and their protest if that's the behavior that they're displaying?
Well, let's put it this way. If you don't allow them inside Parliament, how do you seek to regulate their business outside Parliament? Once a teacher throws you outside the classroom, does the teacher then continue to exercise power outside the school gate? Not necessarily. It may be bad taste, but in terms of authority, well, the vice president has made his choice by expelling them. And what was that famous line in Urdu poetry? हम आ भी लेते हैं तो हो जाते हैं बदनाम, तुम कत्ल भी करो तो चर्चा नहीं होती. It is like that.
Yeah.
So and as a freedom of speech person, I would say that the vice president is as entitled to imitate the member inside or outside the house. Please do it. The answer to a speech is a speech. The answer to a video is a video.
But Mr. You've answered this question legally. Now I want to understand from you, as an interested viewer of the politics of our country. Let's assume this continues, because that's obviously strategy of the opposition. They're doing so basically there's like suspend karo at this point, right? So their strategy is to go in and disrupt and get suspended. When all of the opposition gets suspended at some point, what happens then? What gets achieved after that? Where do we go because knowing this government, they will continue to pass bills.
I do not expect them to do anything else. But if they suspend every member of the opposition, then they go down in history for having suspended every member of the opposition. And whether the voters reward them for that behavior or not is yet to be seen. But while you speak of the opposition saying, "Mujhe suspend karo," the game on the other side is still a reiteration of the old playbook, which says Manishankar Ayyar ne humko chai wala kaha, falana ne maut ka saudagar kaha, ye wo वगैरह. That exhibition of hurt nationalism, to coin a phrase, that look, because I have been insulted, that insult is not mine alone. This insult is that of the people, and the people have to avenge it. That is a message which the government might well take. But at the end of the day, do they assume that the people are going to constantly fall for it? Have people ceased to vote on roti, kapda, makan, and naukri?
After the recent state elections, it would seem after the recent state elections, Mr. Hegde, that the reading of the opposition of what's happening on the ground might be a little off. Maybe the opposition is not able to fully read and react to voices on the ground.
Well, I do think that the opposition doesn't have a very good finishing and ground game, which maximizes every vote the way that the BJP and its cadre do. They ensure that their voters turn up. They ensure that every last of their voters actually cast the ballot, and they try to depress the votes of those who would vote against them. So very often the saying that the hawa is in their favor, etc., also works its own. But despite everything that the BJP did, despite the bundling of schemes at the last minute and payments directly into bank accounts of 2 months, 3 months of overdue payments suddenly coming in just 2 or 3 days before the elections. That happened in Madhya Pradesh. Despite that, there were about 40% who did not vote for the BJP.
Mm.
So that difference of 8% is effectively 4% or more, which the opposition failed to persuade. Because when you lose a voter for yourself, you in effect make a difference of 2, because one vote goes to the winning side and one vote has gone from your side. So no matter what the margin is, you have to see that the case that has to be made out is to snatch away at least half of that margin towards your side. And that finishing game, unfortunately, the BJP has a stronger cadre and ground game. The opposition currently does not.
Well, suspension of members of parliament was sometimes used as a political tool by the ruling party to suppress the voice of the opposition and pass through controversial bills, which they tend to do on a voice vote, even when the opposition is protesting in the background. But here's a question. The BJP MP from Mysore, Pratap Sima, was the one who signed in those 2 visitors who then jumped from the visiting gallery and released the smoke into Parliament. No action has been taken against him. On the contrary, Mahua Moitra has been expelled. Do you believe again that this disciplinary ethics committee at this point is also being partisan and siding with the BJP?
Well, the ethics committee reflects the composition of parliament. So the BJP will naturally have more members on it.
Mm.
But this is an area where the anti-defection bill does not normally come in. There is no whip that you necessarily have to vote one way or the other. This is where members have to rise above their party affiliations, look at the important place that they and their colleagues found in the House, and work in a bipartisan manner. That sadly doesn't seem to happen.
All right. Mr. Hegde, thank you so much for joining us. And I know that we've disrupted an evening for you and you've given us time. So I really appreciate it. And I do hope that, things look up for our democracy. Whoever is in power takes into consideration voices of the opposition, voices of citizens, questions from journalists, and of course, supports a stronger and a more vibrant judiciary always. Yes,
I
Mr.
have
Hegde.
a last one-liner.
Please.
Just imagine you running a show all by yourself with nobody else talking to you. That's exactly what the ruling party has done.
Or Mr. Hegde, I invite people to talk to me, but I shout over them and listen to nothing that they have to say, which we also know happens in the Indian media, which is perhaps what's also happening in Parliament at this point. Sanjay Hegde, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. For our audience, leave us notes on what you'd like us to take up in the future. It's our aim here with Beetroot News to be able to not just bring you the news in an unemotional way without any sort of opinion. We also want to be able to bring you conversations that help you understand the news better. That remains our aim. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.